My new CEO looked me dead in the eye across the conference table and said, "Lyle, I'm going to be straight with you. Men your age tend to resist transformation. If you can't adapt to where we're taking this company, maybe it's time you considered your options." I was 53 years old. I had spent 22 years building the compliance infrastructure for Meridian Health Solutions from a regional billing office into a nationally certified Medicare contractor. I had personally authored the protocols that kept us out of 2 federal audits that would have destroyed the company before this man even knew our name existed. He was 37. His name was Griffin, and private equity had installed him 6 weeks earlier after acquiring a controlling stake in Meridian. He wore his sleeves rolled up in a way that was supposed to signal he was a doer. He used the word transformation the way other people breathe. I nodded slowly. I said, "I appreciate the transparency, Griffin." Then I picked up my notepad, capped my pen, and walked back to my office. My assistant, a sharp woman named Beverly who had been with me for 9 years, looked up when I came through the door. She read my face the way only someone who has worked beside you for nearly a decade can. "That bad?" she said. "Get me the full text of the False Claims Act," I said, "and pull every compliance report I filed in the last 4 years." She didn't ask why. She just turned to her computer. I sat down at my desk and looked out the window at the parking lot below. It was a Tuesday in October, gray and cold the way Ohio gets before it commits to winter. I thought about my wife, about the vacation we had been planning for our anniversary. I thought about my daughter who had just been accepted to nursing school. I thought about a lot of things that had nothing to do with Griffin or private equity or the word transformation. Then I opened my desk drawer and took out a folder I had started 3 weeks earlier. I want to back up a little because none of what happened next makes sense without understanding what Meridian actually does and why the rules that govern it are not suggestions. Meridian Health Solutions processes Medicare claims on behalf of a network of regional providers. We are what's called a Medicare Administrative Contractor, or MAC. That designation comes from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, and it carries with it a legal and regulatory framework that is, to use a precise term, extremely serious. The False Claims Act, the Anti-Kickback Statute, the conditions of our MAC agreement with the federal government. These are not HR policies. Violations carry civil penalties starting at roughly $14,000 per false claim. The Department of Justice is the enforcement body. Whistleblowers who report violations are protected and in many cases entitled to a portion of any recovery. I had spent 22 years making sure Meridian stayed inside every line. Griffin had been in the building for 6 weeks and had already started moving the lines. It started with what he called a billing efficiency initiative. He brought in a consulting team, 4 young people who carried the same rolled-up sleeve energy he did, and they spent 2 weeks analyzing our claims processing workflow. Their conclusion, presented with great confidence in a slide deck full of animated graphics, was that we were leaving revenue on the table by applying overly conservative claim review standards. I sat in that presentation and felt something cold settle in my stomach. Overly conservative meant that our reviewers were flagging and holding claims that didn't meet CMS documentation requirements before sending them for reimbursement. That is not conservatism, that is the law. Submitting claims that fail CMS documentation requirements to the federal government for reimbursement is a violation of the False Claims Act. It is fraud. I said as much in that meeting, as professionally as I could. I laid out the regulatory framework. I cited the specific provisions. I explained the liability exposure, not just for the company, but potentially for individuals involved in the decision. Griffin smiled. He had a smile that was very good at making you feel like you were the one who didn't understand something obvious. "Lyle," he said, "I think we're going to need to evolve the compliance culture here. The world has changed. CMS enforcement priorities have shifted. We need people who can think dynamically." Dynamically was the new word. I wrote it in my notepad next to the date. Over the following 2 weeks, I submitted 3 formal written objections through the compliance reporting chain. I documented everything. I copied the company's general counsel on each memo. I requested written responses to each objection. I got back 2 emails that said my concerns were noted and under review, and 1 phone call from Griffin's chief of staff, a young man named Perry, who told me that leadership was aligned on the direction and that I should trust the process. I saved every email. I printed every memo. I made copies of every response and stored them in a location that was not in my office. That was 3 weeks before Griffin sat across from me and told me I might want to consider my options. Here is something I learned in 22 years of federal compliance work. The people who decide to cut corners on government contracts almost never understand the specific shape of what they're cutting. They see a policy, and they think policy. They don't see the statute behind it, or the federal regulation behind that, or the enforcement mechanism behind that. They think they're deciding how aggressively to interpret a billing guideline. They don't understand they've just made a decision about whether to commit fraud against the United States government. Griffin thought he was optimizing revenue. He had no idea what he had actually done. After my conversation with Griffin, I went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table with my wife. She is a practical woman. She has been married to a compliance officer for a long time, which means she has heard more about regulatory frameworks and federal contracting requirements than any person should ever have to. She listened to everything I told her, and then she was quiet for a moment. "You've already documented it," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Since the first week," I said. She nodded. "Then you know what to do." I did. The False Claims Act has a provision called the qui tam mechanism. Qui tam comes from a Latin phrase that roughly translates to "who as well for the king as for himself sues in this matter." In practical terms, it means that a private individual who has knowledge of fraud against the federal government can file a lawsuit on the government's behalf. If the government investigates and recovers money, the whistleblower is entitled to between 15 and 30% of the recovery. The whistleblower is also protected from retaliation. I had known about qui tam for 22 years. I had explained it to dozens of people in training sessions and compliance briefings. I had never expected to use it myself. I called an attorney the next morning, not a general practice attorney, a firm that specialized specifically in False Claims Act litigation. I had actually referred that firm to a colleague once, years earlier, when he had a situation at a different company. I remembered their name. I'd even kept their card in a folder in my filing cabinet at home. Not because I expected to need it, but because I am the kind of person who keeps things like that. The attorney I spoke with, a methodical woman who asked very precise questions and wrote down every answer, listened to my full account over 3 hours across 2 meetings. She reviewed the documentation I had assembled. She was quiet for a long moment when I finished. "You filed written objections before any of the non-compliant billing occurred?" she asked. 3 separate memos, I said, dated, copied to General Counsel with written acknowledgement received on 2 of the 3. She looked at her notes. "And the directive to change the claim review standards, that was communicated to the processing team in writing?" "It is an internal policy memo dated October 2nd, I said. "I have a copy." She set down her pen. "Lyle," she said, "you've done most of the work already." We filed the qui tam complaint under seal with the Federal District Court. Under the False Claims Act, the filing remains sealed while the Department of Justice investigates and decides whether to intervene. That process can take months, sometimes longer. I went back to work. This is the part that people find hardest to understand. I went back to my office the next day and the day after that, and I did my job. I was polite to Griffin. I was professional with Perry and the consulting team. I attended the meetings I was invited to. I submitted the reports I was required to submit. I noted every new development in my documentation file. I said nothing about what I had filed. Beverly noticed something had changed in me. Not outwardly. I was the same as always, or close enough. But she had known me for 9 years. One afternoon, she brought me a coffee I hadn't asked for, set it on my desk, and said quietly, "Whatever you've got going, just know I think you're right." I thanked her. I didn't say anything else. I couldn't, not while the filing was under seal. 3 weeks after I filed, Griffin called me into his office and informed me that my position was being restructured. The compliance function was being absorbed into the finance department. My role would be redefined to focus on operational reporting rather than regulatory oversight. In practice, this meant I would be reviewing spreadsheets instead of doing the work I had spent 22 years doing. It also meant a reduction in compensation. He called it a right-sizing initiative. I looked at him across his desk for a moment. I thought about the sealed complaint sitting in a federal courthouse. I thought about the attorney's advice. Document the retaliation. Do not resign. Do not give them cause to argue you left voluntarily. "I understand," I said. "I'll need the new job description in writing." He blinked. He had expected something different. Argument, maybe. Emotion. The kind of reaction that would make it easier to move toward a termination. "Of course," he said. Perry will send it over." "Thank you," I said. I stood up, extended my hand, and he shook it because there was nothing else to do. I walked back to my office, updated my documentation file, and forwarded Perry's email with the new job description to my attorney before I even read it all the way through. The Department of Justice moved faster than my attorney had expected. Something about the timing, the specific documentation trail, the scope of the billing changes, and the clear paper record showing I had raised objections before they were implemented apparently made the investigation more straightforward than usual. My attorney told me later that the DOJ attorneys had called my documentation unusually thorough. 22 years of compliance work will do that. I won't describe the full investigation in detail, partly because some of it remains confidential, and partly because most of it I only learned about after the fact. What I can tell you is that federal investigators have access to things that individual employees don't: emails that have been deleted, internal communications between Griffin and the private equity firm's leadership, financial projections that showed exactly what the billing efficiency initiative was expected to generate, and how that number had been communicated to investors. It turned out that what Griffin had described to me as evolving the compliance culture had been promised to his investors as a 15% revenue increase in the first year. And the only way to produce that number, as my documentation and the investigator's review made clear, was to submit claims to Medicare that did not meet the requirements for reimbursement. The amount of money involved was significant. Federal investigators calculated that in the 4 months between the policy change and the point at which CMS flagged the anomaly in the claims data, Meridian had submitted over $42 million in non-compliant claims and received reimbursement on approximately 60% of them. I learned all of this much later. At the time, I was still coming into the office every day, reviewing spreadsheets, going to the meetings I was invited to, and keeping very careful records of everything. The morning the DOJ attorneys and CMS investigators showed up at Meridian's offices, I was in a quarterly reporting review with Perry and 2 members of the finance team. Perry's phone buzzed. Then it buzzed again. He glanced at it, and his face changed. He stood up and said he had to step out. He came back 2 minutes later and said he needed to reschedule. His voice had a quality I had never heard from him before. He was 31 years old and looked suddenly younger. I gathered my materials, walked back to my office, and called my attorney. "I know," she said. "They moved this morning." I sat down. Outside my window, the parking lot was full of cars. The sky was that flat gray that Ohio does in winter. "What happens now?" I said. "Now we wait," she said. "You've done everything right." Beverly appeared in my doorway. She had been watching the lobby, where 2 people in professional clothing who were very clearly not Meridian employees were speaking with the receptionist. "Lyle," she said. "I know," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she went back to her desk, sat down, and folded her hands in her lap with the composure of a woman who has worked for a compliance officer for 9 years and understands, finally, why thoroughness matters. Griffin resigned 11 days later. The press release called it a mutual decision to pursue other opportunities, which is what press releases always say. Perry was gone the same week. The private equity firm announced it was conducting an internal review. 3 members of the board stepped down over the following month. The Department of Justice announced a settlement with Meridian Health Solutions 5 months after the initial investigation began. The settlement required the company to repay the full amount of the non-compliant claims, plus penalties and interest. The total figure was in the range of $38 million. Under the qui tam provisions of the False Claims Act, I received a portion of that recovery. I have been asked, more than once, whether I feel any satisfaction about what happened to Griffin specifically, whether there's something that feels like revenge in this story. I've thought about that question carefully. Honestly, no. Not the way people mean when they say revenge. Griffin made a decision without understanding what he was deciding. He saw a number on a slide deck and thought it was achievable. He didn't understand the architecture of what he was dismantling. That's not malice, exactly. It's a particular kind of arrogance, the arrogance of assuming that rules are just obstacles, that the people who built the systems around you were overcautious, that your confidence is sufficient to replace their expertise. I spent 22 years making sure that the people at Meridian never had to experience the consequences of that arrogance. Then someone decided my experience was a liability instead of an asset. The consequence wasn't mine to deliver. I just made sure it was documented. My wife and I took that anniversary trip we had been planning. My daughter started nursing school in January. Beverly was promoted to compliance coordinator under the interim leadership team, which I considered one of the better outcomes of the whole situation. She earned it. I still work in federal healthcare compliance, different company, different office, same window view of a parking lot in winter. On my desk, I keep a single printed copy of the False Claims Act, the same one I've had for years, the margins filled with notes in my own handwriting from every training session I've ever led. I don't keep it as a trophy. I keep it because it's a working document. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't glance at it occasionally and think, 22 years, every word, every line. It turns out that was worth something after all. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the morning the investigators walked into Meridian's lobby. Not the day Griffin's resignation was announced. It's the afternoon Beverly set a coffee on my desk without being asked, looked at me and said quietly, "Whatever you've got going, I think you're right." She didn't know the details. She just knew me. 9 years of watching how I worked, and that was enough for her to reach a conclusion. I think about that a lot when people ask me whether the whole thing was worth it. What Griffin never understood, what people like Griffin almost never understand, is that the rules he decided to bend weren't arbitrary. They existed because, at some point, someone got hurt badly enough that the government had to step in and write them down. The False Claims Act has been around since the Civil War. It was written because contractors were selling the Union Army diseased mules and cardboard boots and calling it a fair deal. The law exists because arrogance has consequences, and sometimes those consequences need to be formalized. I spent 22 years understanding that, not just memorizing it, actually understanding it. The reason behind each regulation, the injury each provision was designed to prevent. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from ambition. It comes from caring enough to pay attention when the details feel tedious, when the room is tired and the meeting is running long and everyone just wants to go home. Integrity, I've found, is mostly built in those moments, not the dramatic ones. The quiet ones where nobody is watching and you could easily let something slide. The intelligence part, knowing the qui-tam mechanism, knowing the documentation standards, knowing which emails to save and how to date a memo, that wasn't luck either. I had learned those things the same way I learned everything else in my career, by taking my job seriously enough to understand it completely. Griffin walked into Meridian with confidence. I walked in every day for 22 years with comprehension. Those are not the same thing, and eventually the difference shows. And then there's the part people overlook entirely, which is the waiting. Filing the complaint was one afternoon. The months after that, coming in every day, doing a diminished job with the same care I'd always brought to it, sitting across from people who thought they had outmaneuvered me while I said nothing. That took something different. That took the kind of quiet endurance that doesn't get credited until it's over. I wasn't performing patience. I was just committed to the outcome, and I knew the outcome required time. Beverly got her promotion. My daughter started nursing school. My wife and I finally took that trip. Griffin is somewhere else now, doing something else, probably rolling up his sleeves and talking about transformation. And I still have that copy of the False Claims Act on my desk. The margins are full of notes in my own handwriting. It is not a trophy. It is a working document. But every now and then I look at it and think about what 22 years of showing up correctly is actually worth. Turns out the number is fairly specific.